Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. This week, we're going to be looking at joy. But before we dig into the scripture, it would be good to differentiate between happiness and joy. We often use those two words interchangeably, but they are different. Happiness is more of a fleeting emotion, usually triggered by some event that brings a sense of excitement. Some examples, of course, would be things like getting that unexpected gift, watching your favorite sports team achieve a victory. But joy, on the other hand, now that's more of a long-lasting state of being. And it's characterized by contentment and satisfaction. And I liken happiness to a roller coaster, right? Up and down, just depending on what's going on around us. But joy is more that steady bedrock that's always there. So let's keep that in mind as we continue in the unit that's called Looking Forward to Christmas. This is the third lesson. It's called Looking Forward to Joy. And the focal passage is out of Luke chapter 2, verses 4 through 14. And the point of the lesson is Jesus has come, giving us much cause for joy. Well, the word joy is only used one time in this passage, but I believe we can see that term. We can see joy interwoven all through these verses. So the first set of verses we're going to be looking at this week is Luke chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. And in verse 4, we see that Joseph is traveling from Nazareth. Now that's in the north, that's in Galilee, 80 miles to the south in Bethlehem in Judea, to register for the census that was described back in verses 1, 2, and 3. Now, when we describe traveling south, we normally use the word down instead of up, such as we traveled down from Wichita to Dallas last weekend. So why would Luke say that Joseph went up from Nazareth in the north to Bethlehem in the south? Well, it's because it was up. It was up in elevation. Nazareth is around 1,140 feet above sea level, and Bethlehem is 2,540 feet above sea level. It's a difference of about 1,400 feet. So yes, he was definitely going up to Bethlehem. So I really haven't thought about this until I started studying this lesson, but I wonder if Joseph and Mary traveled straight from Nazareth in the north to Bethlehem in the south, kind of a straight line as much as they could, or did they do like most Jews did during that time and refused to go through Samaria, and they crossed over the Jordan River and went south and then crossed back over and avoided Samaria altogether? I don't know. I guess it really doesn't matter, but my brain sometimes thinks these things. Well, can you imagine when they first got the news that they were going to have to travel that distance, that the census was taking place? How disappointed they were, and perhaps even worried because Mary was pregnant. They're going to have to travel all this way. But you know what? God used pagan rulers to accomplish his will. Joseph and Mary, they were residents of Nazareth, but the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem, as Micah 5 verse 2 tells us. So how's that going to happen? Well, there's a decree, I mentioned this earlier, mentioned back in Luke chapter 1, that took care of that. But also in Hosea chapter 11 verse 1, God said, I will call my son up out of Egypt. How could the Messiah be from Nazareth, be born in Bethlehem, yet be called out of Egypt? Well, God used an insanely murderous Herod to accomplish this, as Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15 tells us that story. Well, verse 5 back in Luke might present a problem to us, because in Matthew chapter 1, verses 24 and 25, that tells us that after Joseph's encounter with the angel, remember he was going to divorce Mary because she was pregnant, and he knew it wasn't his. Well, after that encounter with the angel, he decided not to break off the betrothal, but he took Mary home as his wife, but did not consummate the marriage until after she gave birth to Jesus. So in Matthew, we're told that they were married before Jesus was born. But now, here in Luke, we read that Joseph was traveling to Bethlehem with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him. So were they married or not at this time? And why does there seem to be some discrepancy here? Well, first, let's remember that the betrothal period was much more legally binding back then than our contemporary engagement period is now. To cancel the betrothal meant the couple actually had to go through divorce proceedings. But even though the betrothal period it was legally binding, sexual relations were still forbidden until after the marriage ceremony, which could be up to a year after the betrothal period began. Now, this is just my speculation, but it could be that this was to prevent what we've termed a shotgun wedding, right? The woman finds herself pregnant, so a quick wedding is thrown together to cover up the fact that the couple had sex before the ceremony. So this 1 year waiting period would absolve any of those suspicions. So there was the betrothal, then the ceremony, but the marriage wasn't legal until consummation. Now, to me, that explains why Matthew said they were married, but Luke, now he's a physician, probably very technical, very precise, stated that they were betrothed at the time of the birth. The ceremony had happened, but consummation hadn't. Well, verse 7 states that Mary gave birth to her firstborn son. Not her only son, but her firstborn son. And here we get a glimpse of the humility of Jesus. Of course, that's mentioned over in Philippians chapter 2, how humble he was. This is God himself, the creator of life, of everything, going through the human birth process. He was born to ordinary, probably poor parents. He was placed in a manger, which is a feeding trough. His first guests, as we're going to look at here in a little bit, were shepherds, and these were some of the lowest class of people. He was raised in Nazareth, which had a not so great reputation. In John 1, verse 46, Nathanael said, when he was told about Jesus of Nazareth, he said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" I grew up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and am currently now, I live in a town that adjoins it. Pine Bluff has had that reputation, has had it for quite a while. And there's probably a town or two in each state that has that reputation as well, that, can anything good come out of that? Well, even though joy is not specifically mentioned here, I think we can safely assume that Mary and Joseph were experiencing the joy at the birth of this baby, because God's promise that this child was going to be born, it's happened. And remember that promise was communicated through the angel Gabriel. It was promised, it's happened. And maybe they reflected on that passage in Micah, that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem, and that's where they've ended up. And that brought joy to them, that they were chosen to be part of God's redemptive plan for humanity. Mary and Joseph weren't wealthy people, and these were very modest at the most circumstances. I think this teaches us that true joy is not rooted in material wealth or worldly recognition, but in the presence of God, the presence of God with us, right? In the presence of Emmanuel. Well, in Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 12, that's our next set of verses, we're introduced to the shepherds in the Christmas story. Shepherding is one of those oldest professions. Adam was given dominion over the animal kingdom. Abel was a keeper of the sheep. Jacob and his sons, Moses, David, all of them shepherds. And in many ways, shepherding was a noble profession, but they had a difficult time keeping ritualistically pure. Sheep need constant care, so shepherds couldn't keep the Sabbath. These men spent most of their time in fields, away from others, so they really had very little influence. Now, we really shouldn't romanticize their profession. They were often dishonest, social outcasts with the reputation of what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. Not the ideal group of people to announce the birth of the Messiah to. Now, in the countryside near Bethlehem, the shepherds' primary responsibility was to guard the sheep. Some of those which could be used for temple sacrifices. How appropriate that the first people to hear about Jesus' birth were those who guarded the sacrifices that this Messiah would later replace when his crucifixion and resurrection permanently atoned for sins. What was symbolic about God announcing Jesus' birth to the lowliest members of society? Well, the good news is for all people, right? The shepherds represented the outcasts and sinners for whom Jesus came. And this good news was going to have an effect. What was that effect? Well, it's right there in verse 10. The effect is great joy. Not just joy, but great joy. And not just for the pious and religious leaders, but for all people, even these lowly shepherds. In fact, they were the ones who were privileged to receive the birth announcement. It was for them as well. And it's going to dawn on Jesus' followers later that all people even included Gentiles. Well, shepherds were out in the fields with their flocks, usually during the months of March to November. There's nothing in the two birth accounts that ties Jesus' birth to any specific date, but most likely it was not in winter. Well, let's note the three titles that are given to Jesus there in verse 11. The first is Savior. The name Jesus is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew name Joshua, both meaning the Lord saves, Yahweh saves. And that's why Jesus came, isn't it? To save people from their sins. Then you have Messiah or Christ, and that's, of course, means the anointed one. As the promised Messiah, Jesus is the anointed one, fulfilling God's promises to his people. And the last title there is Lord. Now, generally this means a boss, right? Specifically, though, this refers to his divinity. He is the boss. As Lord, he holds ultimate authority and reigns over all creation. Well, these truths about Jesus should bring us lasting joy because they assure us of God's love, his faithfulness, and redemptive plan for the world. Well, where was this newly born Messiah to be found? In the city of David, which was Bethlehem. Even though Bethlehem was prophesied to be the birthplace of the Messiah, it was never really a large town. There again, I believe this is just another example of God using the lesser things in the world to accomplish his will. And being that Bethlehem was a small town, a little village, finding a newborn baby lying in a feeding trough wouldn't be too difficult. They may have even used their sense of hearing to follow the baby's cries. Now, contrary to away in the manger, no crying he makes, okay, I believe, since Jesus was fully human, I do believe that he cried as a baby, but that's my opinion. Well, our last two verses are Luke chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. And in verse 13, we read of a great company of the heavenly host. Well, that word host usually applies to an army, but this was an army of angels proclaiming peace, not war. This heavenly chorus shows us that the joy of heaven itself was present at the birth of Jesus. The angels glorified God for his perfect plan of salvation and proclaimed peace for those who accepted his favor. Their worship reminds us that joy naturally leads to praise. When we recognize the depth of God's love and the gift of salvation, our hearts are moved to glorify him. Now here's a little extra, something I'd like for you to think about. And that is the similarities surrounding Jesus' birth and his death. Those two bookends of his earthly ministry. He went from a virgin womb to an unused tomb. Mary wrapped the newborn baby in cloths. Joseph of Arimathea wrapped Jesus' lifeless body in cloth. Most likely, Jesus was born in a cave. When it came time for his death, he was placed in a newly hewn tomb, basically a cave. Mary was present both at his birth, of course, and crucifixion. And then there's two Josephs. There's Jesus' earthly father at his birth, Joseph of Arimathea at his death. One final thought. Every other religion attempts to reach up to God with good deeds, to win his approval, all that. But in Christianity, it was God who took the initiative, who reached down to us, who came to us. That should bring joy to your heart. Well, Sunday school leader, your class attendance, well, most likely it's going to be down the next 2 or 3 Sundays, so don't be alarmed. Don't let it steal your joy, okay? That's just, 'tis the season, as I like to say. Well, next week we're going to be in John chapters 1 and 3 as we look at looking forward to love. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you're having a great Christmas season so far. Don't forget to pray for and with your class.